Hello and welcome back to the channel, everyone. My name is Sam. In today's video I want to talk about suffering and what role it potentially plays on a spiritual path. In many traditions of spirituality, and I would say in many religions or even most religions, suffering plays quite the crucial part. In Buddhism, for example, if we look at the story of the historical Buddha, we see that his quest for enlightenment actually was started by the suffering he saw in the world and thereby also experienced himself. So it seems quite obvious that suffering is quite the important topic. So in this video I want to discuss what role suffering plays in our own path of spirituality. I first want to make the argument for why suffering does play an important role in our path. But I also want to present an argument for why suffering is often overemphasized, why we shouldn't fetishize it, why we shouldn't make it an essential part of our spiritual path. So first off, I want to explain why suffering can play an important role on a genuine spiritual path. You see, most people, generally speaking, don't have a natural interest in matters of spirituality. For most people, it's the case that they live their life more or less happy or unhappy, and they're quite content living that way. They don't ask themselves deep questions about what the nature of reality is, what the nature of their own being is. And obviously that's perfectly fine. If you're happy living that way, by all means, go ahead. I have nothing to say against that. But of course, what happens to some people is that their suffering starts to catch up with them. And this can take, of course, many different forms. It is, of course, right to say that for all human beings, and depending on where you grew up and what your life circumstances are, suffering is always a part of your life. But mostly, we are able to deal with it more or less well. It's okay. We see it's a part of this game of life we play, and generally, people often feel that the positive aspects of life outweigh the negative ones. But what also often happens is that the suffering aspects of our lives start to become more prominent. And this can of course take many different forms. For some people, it is one single traumatic event that all of a sudden completely shifts their world. Maybe they were more or less happy before, but then something happens that completely interrupts their normality. Negative emotions start to become the norm. The things they used to do for fun don't bring them joy anymore. Their relationships suffer. They might feel anxious in situations where they weren't before, all just based off a single traumatic event they experienced. But for other people, this shift where suffering becomes more prominent in their life is not quite as dramatic. Maybe for them it's more so the case that over time and slowly they become more and more unsatisfied with how their life is going. Even though objectively everything is going more or less alright, they start to feel unsatisfied and unhappy. They notice that the things that they thought would fulfill them actually don't on a deep level. They maybe see that the goals they set out for themselves, which they strived for a very long time and finally reached, didn't bring them the permanent peace they were hoping for. And in this case, the suffering may start out more subtle, but eventually might grow into something quite big where people feel like they need to do dramatic changes in their lives. Their behavior changes, their relationships suffer, and all these things start to happen that you would normally expect from somebody who had quite the traumatic experience. So no matter how we get there, it is just often the case that at one point or another, we've had enough. We notice that we can't keep living this way. We recognize the deep unhappiness, the lack of peace, the unwellness. We notice how it affects all aspects of our lives. And naturally, we want to do something about it. Looking at my own life and what led me to a spiritual path, I can see both the traumatic single events that affected me, but also the disillusionment that happened over the course of many years, where I just became more unhappy and unsatisfied with how my life was going and who I was as a person. For a very long time, I felt like I could handle what was happening. Even though things were bothering me, there were things I was unhappy with. It felt like it was at a normal level, or I could at least rise to the challenge if things got worse. But at some point, I hit a clear breaking point. Something happened that showed me that I needed something else. I needed something that was outside of the realm of what I was usually doing and pursuing. You see, general challenges of life were alright to me. I even sought them out intentionally because I enjoyed overcoming them. But then, when I encountered something that I couldn't overcome, I knew I had to seek something different. What happened was that I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. What made matters even worse, though, was that in the beginning stages, the symptoms were quite similar to a form of cancer. And to my great surprise, this triggered an unbelievable existential fear in me. I was shocked by this fear. I didn't know that I even had the potential to feel something like that. You see, before that, I considered myself quite the tough person. I overcame many challenges. I was competing as a martial artist. I could endure physical and psychological pain quite well. But this was a challenge I was not equipped to deal with. All of a sudden, I wasn't faced with an external challenge or enemy that I could fight against and overcome. This challenge, this fear, this suffering came from something deep inside me. It came from the belief that I was a limited entity that was going to die. The fear of complete disappearance suddenly was there, and it overwhelmed me. It forced me to do something else. I knew that all the tools I had at my disposal were not enough to deal with this. And while I already had some sort of spiritual interest before that, this suffering was what really drove me to focus on it. I had this deep intuition that on this spiritual path was something that would ease my pain, that would free me from the suffering I was feeling. So you see that in my case, suffering was crucial to my spiritual development. I'm quite sure that if I didn't hit this roadblock where I was overwhelmed and I couldn't continue, that maybe I would have just tried to live on the best I could as I did before. I would have continued living, believing to be the separate entity inside of a body-mind, which can overcome challenges, which can deal with the challenges of life in an ordinary way. It was only this overwhelming anxiety that I had that finally made me realize that I needed to stop. I needed to question the core beliefs I had about myself. So what I want to say in conclusion about this way of looking at suffering is that yes, it can be helpful. It can be the thing that triggers your spiritual interest and eventually will lead you to a path where you will find deep peace. But I also want to say a word of caution here. What often happens is that people put their suffering in such focus that it in itself becomes central. They put their suffering on a pedestal, make it something special, something maybe even necessary and important. And this has several downsides to it. For one, as is often the case, if you focus on something more, you feel it more intensely, it will overwhelm you more, it will seem like a bigger deal than it is. And so it is with the aspects of your lives that cause you suffering. By making them the primary focus of your life, you might just intensify them, even though your intention is to actually get rid of them. But what happens furthermore as well is that our interest in the deepest reality of our being becomes tainted in a way. We want to discover our true nature because we are hoping for a specific result. We want to discover it because we think if we do, we will finally be free of our suffering. Now, while it is true that the discovery of our true being has the potential to free us from our suffering, making this an explicit goal can be dangerous. What happens is that our interest in our true nature is not honest anymore. Instead, there's always this thought in the background that I have to recognize my true nature because I want to be free of suffering. And this puts a tremendous amount of pressure on our investigation of what we really are. This pressure, this seeking energy, only actually intensifies our suffering then. So what can happen is that there's not just the suffering of the situation, but then there's also the suffering of trying to discover something that will finally free us. So while it is true, as I said earlier, that suffering can be the instigator that puts you on a path to peace, if this desire to be free of psychological pain becomes overwhelmingly strong, it might just complicate matters and might make us feel worse. But there's also another way in which explicitly trying to get rid of your suffering can hinder you on your spiritual path. Let me use an analogy here. If a scientist wants to conduct a proper experiment, he has to make sure that he's not trying to produce a specific result. He has to perform the experiment as honestly as he can. If he is looking to cook the books, so to say, if he's looking to cheat and make a certain result happen, of course the process of research will be affected by that. Nobody wants to trust a scientist, for example, if he knows that he has some financial gain if a specific result is proven to be true. Naturally, you would assume that maybe he faked something, he deceived himself or others to find exactly what he was looking for. And this becomes a hindrance to discovering the truth. And any genuine spiritual path has, in the end, the goal of discovering a deep truth about yourself. True spirituality doesn't have the goal of deceiving yourself in order to make you feel better. No, the goal is to discover something that is essentially true about yourself. And the side effect of this discovery is that you will be free from your psychological suffering. So what can we do to avoid making this mistake? Instead of trying to accomplish something, instead of thinking that you have to understand something in order to be free of your suffering, have an attitude of genuine interest and enjoyment. Approach the understanding of your true nature like a child would who goes out into the forest and is just excited to discover what he can find. Bring an energy of genuine curiosity instead. Be completely open, without expectation about what you find. Just be interested, without looking for anything specific. Don't even look for an emotional high or a moment of tremendous insight that will just blow your mind away. Just see honestly what you discover about yourself. And with that, a sort of positive joy and interest in your true nature often naturally arises. Now again, don't try to make this happen. Don't try to force a fake sense of enjoyment. Just be open and interested. Notice what is really there to notice. You see, the amazing thing about our true nature is, it is the way it is, whether you want it to be or not want it to be that way. It already is this dimensionless, boundless, open clarity. It already is totally free from the world, but also completely intimate with it. You don't have to make this happen, but it's there to be recognized. I hope you found this discussion of suffering on the spiritual path interesting. Let me know what your thoughts are. Have you maybe fallen into the trap in the past of trying to be mindful or trying to discover something about yourself in order to achieve a specific result? How did you overcome that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe as well if you want to stay up to date on my latest videos. Thank you for watching, and I will see you here next time.